6 months after I moved to Manila, I opened my laptop and typed my old address into the search bar. The house appeared immediately. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a small covered patio where my husband and I used to drink coffee before the Arizona heat became unbearable. The listing still had every photograph from the sale. My kitchen, my bedroom, the living room where we had celebrated birthdays, Christmases, and more ordinary evenings than I could ever count. Only none of it belonged to me anymore. I had sold the house, my car, and nearly everything inside before moving to the Philippines. At the time, I called it freedom. But that night, sitting alone in a rented apartment in Manila, freedom felt more like being trapped on the wrong side of a locked door. I kept staring at the photographs until I did something I'm still embarrassed to admit. I emailed the real estate agent who had sold the house and asked whether the new owners might consider selling it back to me. Her answer arrived the following morning. They had just moved in. They loved the house, and they weren't interested in selling. That was the moment the panic became real. For the first time since leaving America, I understood that going back wouldn't mean returning to the life I had left. That life was gone, and I was the one who had sold it. My name is Diane. I was 70 years old when I packed what remained of my life into 4 suitcases and moved from Arizona to Manila, Philippines. No one forced me to leave. I wasn't running from the law, escaping a scandal, or chasing someone I had met online. I moved because I believed I had found a smarter way to retire. For the first few months, I was convinced I had made the best decision of my life. 6 months later, I wanted almost everything back. This is how it happened. Chapter 1: The House That No Longer Felt Like Security. 4 years before I moved to the Philippines, my husband Paul died at the age of 71. We had been married for 38 years. Paul wasn't the kind of man who filled a room with stories. He was quiet, dependable, and happiest when he had something to repair. A loose cabinet hinge, a dripping faucet, a ceiling fan that made a noise no one else could hear. For most of our marriage, I thought those little repairs were simply how he spent his weekends. After he was gone, I understood they were one of the ways he had taken care of me. The house began breaking almost immediately. At least, that was how it felt. The air conditioner needed servicing twice during the first summer. The water heater started leaking. A section of the backyard fence leaned into the neighbor's property after a windstorm. None of the repairs were catastrophic, but every problem required a phone call, an appointment, and another bill. Paul and I had purchased the house when we were still working. By the time he died, the mortgage had been paid off. Everyone told me how fortunate I was. "You own your home," they would say. "At least you'll always have that security." I believed them. But owning a house and being able to afford the life surrounding it are not exactly the same thing. There were property taxes, insurance, electricity, maintenance, and repairs. My car was getting older. Groceries seemed to cost more every month. Then my homeowner's insurance increased again. I wasn't poor, I want to make that clear. I received Social Security, a small survivor benefit, and had money in savings. But I had entered the stage of retirement where every unexpected expense seemed to carry a second question. If I pay for this now, what happens later? If the air conditioner costs $8,000 to replace, what happens when the roof needs work? If I live another 15 years, will the money last? And if it doesn't, who will I become dependent on? Those thoughts rarely came during the daytime. They arrived after midnight, when the house was quiet, and every financial fear seemed more certain than it had a few hours earlier. My daughter lived in Colorado with her husband and 2 children. My son was in Texas, working long hours and raising a family of his own. They called me. They invited me for holidays. They loved me. But they also had mortgages, careers, children, and problems they didn't always tell me about. I didn't want my retirement to become one more responsibility they had to manage. So I started cutting expenses. First, I canceled the landscaping service and tried to maintain the yard myself. That lasted until I became lightheaded outside one afternoon and had to sit on the patio floor until the dizziness passed. Then I stopped eating out as often. I delayed replacing the living room furniture, even though one side of the couch had begun to sink. I drove less. I adjusted the thermostat. I compared prices at 3 grocery stores before buying anything that wasn't essential. None of those changes made me miserable on their own. What bothered me was the direction my life seemed to be moving. Every year, my world became slightly smaller, so I could continue affording the house that was supposed to make me feel secure. One Tuesday morning, I received an estimate to replace part of the roof. The contractor stood in my driveway explaining materials, labor, and warranties, while I pretended the total hadn't frightened me. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table with the estimate in front of me. I looked around the room and asked myself a question I had avoided for years. Why was I working so hard to preserve a house built for 2 people when only one person lived there? I didn't need 3 bedrooms. I barely entered Paul's workshop anymore. The dining table could seat 8, but most evenings I ate alone in front of the television. Selling the house had crossed my mind before, but I had always dismissed it. Where would I go? A smaller house in Arizona would still be expensive. Rent had increased dramatically. Moving closer to either of my children would place me in cities that cost even more. I could sell the house, spend a large part of the proceeds purchasing something smaller, and still have many of the same monthly expenses. It felt like exchanging one version of the problem for another. That afternoon, while searching online for retirement costs in other states, I found a video made by an American woman living in the Philippines. She was walking through a grocery store in Manila, explaining what she spent during an ordinary week. I almost closed it. The Philippines had never been part of my retirement plan. I had traveled outside the United States only a few times, and always with Paul. But something made me continue watching. The woman appeared to be around my age. She lived in a furnished apartment. She didn't own a car. Restaurants, pharmacies, and grocery stores were nearby. She talked about hiring someone to clean twice a month and taking a taxi whenever she needed to go somewhere. Her life didn't look extravagant. It looked manageable. That word stayed with me. Manageable. I watched another video that evening, then another. Within 2 weeks, I had filled several pages of a notebook with estimated expenses: rent, electricity, food, health insurance, visa extensions, flights back to America. I converted Philippine pesos into dollars so many times that I no longer needed a calculator for the smaller amounts. On paper, the difference looked enormous. If I sold the house and invested most of the proceeds, I could rent in Manila without touching much of the principal. My Social Security could cover my regular expenses. I would no longer worry about roofs, property taxes, air conditioners, or maintaining rooms I didn't use. For the first time since Paul died, retirement didn't look like a slow financial decline. It looked like a second chance. My daughter was the first person I told. We were speaking on the phone when I casually mentioned that I had been researching the Philippines. There was a long silence. Then she asked the question I should have spent much more time considering. "Mom, are you thinking about visiting? Or are you thinking about moving?" I looked around the kitchen, at the roof estimate, at Paul's empty chair, at 38 years of memories attached to a house I was increasingly afraid to own. "I think I'm ready to sell," I told her. The truth was, I had never been less certain of anything. But once I said the words aloud, they began to sound like a decision. My daughter didn't try to talk me out of moving, at least not immediately. Instead, she asked practical questions. Where would I live? What kind of health insurance would I have? Did Medicare cover me in the Philippines? What would happen if I became seriously ill? I had answers for some of those questions. Others were based on articles, videos, and comments from people I had never met. When my daughter noticed the uncertainty in my voice, she made one request. Please visit before you sell the house. That seemed reasonable. 3 months later, I boarded a flight to Manila with a round-trip ticket, 1 suitcase, and a reservation for 12 nights at a hotel in Makati. I told myself it was a research trip, but I had already spent months imagining my new life. Without realizing it, I wasn't going to Manila to decide whether I should move. I was going there to confirm a decision I had nearly made. The first thing I noticed was the traffic. The second was the heat. Even after sunset, the air felt heavy compared with the dry Arizona climate I knew. By the time I reached the hotel, my clothes were sticking to me, and I was beginning to wonder whether 12 days would be enough. Then the hotel doors opened. The lobby was cool and bright. A young employee greeted me by name after checking my reservation. Someone carried my suitcase upstairs. My room had a view of the city, fresh towels, and an air conditioner that had already been turned on. The discomfort of the journey disappeared almost immediately. The next morning, I walked to a nearby cafe and ordered breakfast. The meal cost less than I expected, and everyone I spoke with treated me kindly. I visited shopping centers, parks, and furnished apartments. I downloaded a transportation app and discovered I could get almost anywhere without driving. For someone who had spent years worrying about an aging car, insurance, and repairs, that alone felt liberating. On my 4th day, I met a small group of foreign retirees for lunch. They told me where to shop, which neighborhoods to consider, and how visa extensions worked. One woman had lived in Manila for nearly 6 years. When I asked whether she regretted leaving America, she laughed. My only regret is that I waited so long. That sentence followed me for the remainder of the trip. I toured 3 apartments. The first was too small. The second faced a busy road. The third was a furnished 1-bedroom unit in a modern building with security downstairs and a grocery store nearby. The agent opened the curtains and sunlight filled the living room. I imagined placing my photographs on the shelf. I imagined drinking coffee beside the window. I imagined living there without worrying about the roof, the yard, or the next expensive repair. The rent was considerably less than the total cost of maintaining my house in Arizona. I didn't sign anything, but I took photographs from every corner. At night, I sent them to my children. My daughter remained cautious. My son was more direct. "You're on vacation, Mom. Living there won't feel the same." I told him I understood, but I didn't. During those 12 days, someone cleaned my room, replaced my towels, and prepared most of my meals. I stayed in one of Manila's most convenient areas and used my savings without following an ordinary monthly budget. I didn't refill a prescription. I didn't deal with a power interruption. I didn't spend an entire week alone. I didn't need to extend a visa, open a bank account, or find a doctor I trusted. Most importantly, I always knew I had a flight home. That return ticket made every inconvenience feel temporary. Traffic was an experience. The heat was something to laugh about. Homesickness never had time to arrive. By the final day, I had stopped asking whether I could live in Manila. I was asking how quickly I could return. When my flight landed in Arizona, the house felt enormous. Dust had gathered on the furniture. The rooms were silent, and the roof estimate was still sitting on the kitchen counter. I unpacked the small gifts I had purchased and placed them beside the photographs of Paul. Then I walked from room to room, mentally deciding what I would sell, donate, or take with me. My children believed the trip would make me more cautious. Instead, it gave me just enough confidence to make the biggest decision of my life, and not nearly enough experience to understand it. I contacted a real estate agent the week after I returned. She walked through the house with a tablet, taking notes while I followed behind her. She pointed out small improvements that could help it sell: fresh paint in the hallway, new handles on the kitchen cabinets, and several repairs I had postponed. When she told me what she believed the house was worth, I asked her to repeat the number. Paul and I had purchased it decades earlier. I knew property values had increased, but I had never thought of the house as money. It was simply where we lived. After the remaining expenses and fees, the sale could leave me with enough to fund a comfortable retirement if I handled it carefully. The agent suggested listing in 6 weeks. I agreed before I had fully considered what those 6 weeks would require. Every room contained decisions: keep, sell, donate, throw away. At first, I approached it like an ordinary project. I bought colored labels and made lists. I scheduled a garage sale and contacted a company that purchased used furniture. Then I opened the closet in Paul's workshop. His work shirts were still hanging inside. I had avoided that closet since his death. Seeing those shirts made the move feel different. I wasn't simply downsizing. I was dismantling the last home we had shared. I kept one of his shirts, his watch, and a small wooden box he had made for me. Most of his tools went to our son. The rest were sold to a neighbor. Furniture disappeared one piece at a time. The dining table went to a young family. A retired teacher bought the bedroom set. 2 college students carried away the couch as they struggled to fit it through the front door. By the end of the month, my voice echoed in rooms that had never sounded empty before. My daughter again suggested renting a storage unit. "Keep the important things for a year," she said. "You don't have to decide everything right now." I considered it. A storage unit would have cost less than many of the things I was giving away. It would also have provided a small connection to the life I was leaving. But I had become obsessed with the idea of a clean break. Every video and article about moving abroad seemed to celebrate the same thing: freedom from possessions, freedom from bills, and freedom from the life that kept you stuck. I didn't want to pay monthly rent for a room filled with objects I might never use again. I also didn't want to admit that I might come back, so I said no. That decision would later bother me more than selling the furniture. The furniture could be replaced. Photographs, letters, and small pieces of a shared life could not. I scanned what I could and gave several boxes to my children. Everything else had to fit into 4 large suitcases and 1 carry-on bag. The house received an offer 11 days after it was listed. The buyers were a couple in their 30s with a young son. Their offer was slightly below the asking price, but they could close quickly. My agent advised me to accept it. I signed the agreement at the kitchen counter. My hand trembled near the final page. The agent noticed and asked whether I needed more time. I almost said yes. Instead, I signed my name. The closing date was set for 5 weeks later. That gave me a deadline, and deadlines have a way of silencing doubt. Whenever I felt afraid, I found another task to complete. I arranged international health insurance. I opened an account that would allow me to access money overseas. I reserved a furnished apartment in Manila for 3 months so I wouldn't be locked into a long lease. I purchased a round-trip ticket because I needed proof of onward travel to enter the Philippines. The return portion was flexible, and I told my children I could use it if anything went wrong. That reassured them. It also reassured me. But a plane ticket was not a backup plan. It could return me to America. It couldn't return me to my house, my car, or the financial life I had spent decades building. On the morning of the closing, I walked through the house alone. There was no bed, so I had slept on an inflatable mattress. The refrigerator was empty. My suitcases stood beside the front door. I placed my hand on the wall where Paul's photograph had hung. For one brief moment, I wanted to cancel everything. I wanted to unpack the suitcases, call the buyers, and tell them I had changed my mind. Then a car stopped outside to take me to the airport. I locked the door and placed the keys in an envelope for the agent. As we drove away, I turned around for one last look. I expected to feel grief. Instead, I felt lighter. That feeling convinced me I had done the right thing. It would be months before I understood that relief and certainty can feel remarkably similar in the beginning. I arrived in Manila exhausted, nervous, and carrying more luggage than I could manage alone. An airport employee helped place my suitcases onto a cart. A driver was waiting outside with my name written on a small sign. During the ride to Makati, I watched the city pass by the window. Jeepneys moved between buses and motorcycles. Families stood beside food stalls. High-rise buildings appeared behind crowded streets filled with signs, wires, and people. Manila seemed louder than I remembered. It also felt more alive. When I reached the apartment building, the security guard helped unload my luggage and called upstairs to confirm my arrival. The unit was smaller than it had appeared in the photographs. The kitchen had 2 burners, very little counter space, and a refrigerator that reminded me of a college dormitory. But it was clean, furnished, and entirely mine for the next 3 months. That first evening, I stood beside the window and looked at the lights stretching across the city. I had no property taxes, no yard, no leaking water heater, no roof estimate waiting on a kitchen table. For the first time in years, I felt as though my life belonged to me instead of to the things I owned. The following weeks were easier than my children had expected. I learned where to buy groceries and which transportation apps to use. The security guards greeted me whenever I entered the building. A woman at a nearby cafe began preparing my coffee when she saw me approaching. I joined an online group for foreigners living in Manila. Through that group, I met several retirees for lunch twice a month. Some had lived in the Philippines for years. Others had arrived recently and were asking the same questions I was. Being the new person gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time, a reason to be curious. Every ordinary task became an accomplishment. The first time I found a pharmacy on my own, I felt proud. The first time I crossed a busy street without following another pedestrian, I silently congratulated myself. Even learning how to have drinking water delivered made me feel capable. I spoke with my children several times a week. My daughter usually asked whether I was eating properly. My son wanted to know whether I felt safe. I sent them photographs of meals, parks, and shopping centers. I showed them the view from my apartment and introduced them to one of the women I had befriended. "I told you I would be fine," I said. For a while, I was. Financially, the plan seemed to work exactly as I had hoped. My rent was lower than the combined monthly cost of maintaining the house in Arizona. I didn't need a car, and I could eat at local restaurants without feeling guilty about the bill. My regular expenses stayed within my Social Security income. The money from the house remained invested, apart from the amount I had reserved for emergencies and travel. I checked the accounts almost every morning. Seeing those numbers gave me comfort. They were proof that I hadn't acted recklessly. I had exchanged a house that consumed money for investments that could help support me. At least, that was how I viewed it. When the initial 3-month reservation ended, I signed a 1-year lease on another furnished apartment nearby. It was slightly larger and less expensive. The building was older, but it had security, a backup generator for common areas, and a small grocery store within walking distance. Signing that lease felt like a declaration. I was no longer testing life in Manila. I lived there. I celebrated by purchasing a few things for the apartment: better pillows, framed prints, and a comfortable chair beside the window. They were small purchases, but they made the place feel less temporary. During my 4th month, I told my daughter I had no intention of using the return portion of my ticket. "Not even for a visit?" she asked. "Eventually," I said, "but I'm not ready to leave yet." She seemed disappointed, although she tried not to show it. After the call, I wondered whether I should feel guilty. Then I looked around the apartment and reminded myself that I had spent most of my life making decisions around other people. My children were adults. Paul was gone. For once, I was allowed to build a life based on what I wanted. That evening, I met friends for dinner and returned home after dark. The guard opened the door and welcomed me back. Upstairs, I made tea and sat beside the window while rain moved across the city. I remember thinking that I had worried for nothing. I had been afraid of loneliness, culture shock, and regret. Instead, I felt independent, brave even. The trouble was that I had mistaken a successful beginning for proof that the rest would be easy. The change didn't happen in one dramatic moment. There was no terrible confrontation or single event that made me regret moving. It began with small inconveniences that gradually stopped feeling small. The air conditioner in my apartment failed during a particularly humid week. The property manager promised someone would inspect it the following morning. The technician arrived 2 days later, examined the unit, and said a replacement part had to be ordered. For 4 nights, I slept with 2 fans pointed toward the bed. Back in Arizona, I would have called another repair company. In Manila, I was a tenant in a country where I was still learning how things worked. I didn't speak the local languages, I couldn't explain exactly what the technician had said, and I didn't know whether waiting several days was normal. The air conditioner was eventually repaired, but the experience exposed something I hadn't considered. I had given up the burdens of owning a home. I had also given up much of the control. Then I became sick after eating something that didn't agree with me. It wasn't a medical emergency, but I spent 2 days close to the bathroom and struggled to keep anything down. I had medicine, bottled water, and enough food in the apartment. What I didn't have was someone who could come upstairs without being asked. Paul would have known I was sick before I admitted it. He would have brought water, checked my temperature, and annoyed me by asking every 20 minutes whether I needed anything. In Manila, no one knew I hadn't left the apartment. When my daughter called, I told her I was tired. I didn't mention that I had been sick because I knew what she would say. "You're alone over there." She wouldn't have meant it as criticism, but I wasn't ready to hear it. By the 5th month, the group of retirees I had joined began to change. One couple returned to the United States for several months. Another woman moved to Cebu. A man I often spoke with at lunch entered a new relationship and stopped attending. People living abroad were constantly arriving, leaving, or changing plans. I had assumed finding friends would solve the loneliness. I hadn't understood how temporary many of those friendships could be. The cafe employees still greeted me. The guards still smiled when I entered the building. But being recognized was not the same as being known. Some days I had pleasant conversations with 6 people without speaking honestly to any of them. The time difference made contacting my family more difficult. When I was beginning my day, they were preparing for bed. When I felt lonely in the evening, they were working or taking children to school. We scheduled calls, but scheduled conversations felt different from reaching for the phone whenever something happened. My granddaughter lost her first tooth while I was asleep. My son sent a photograph to the family group. By the time I saw it, the conversation had ended hours earlier. That shouldn't have affected me as much as it did. I had missed birthdays and ordinary moments before. Families have always lived in different states and time zones, but now every missed moment seemed connected to the decision I had made. I began questioning experiences that had previously made me proud. Was I independent or isolated? Was I living simply or slowly removing myself from everyone who knew me? Had I chosen this life because I truly wanted it, or because I had been frightened by the cost of growing old in America? I still enjoyed Manila. There were mornings when I walked outside, felt the energy of the city, and knew exactly why I had moved. There were also afternoons when the traffic, noise, and heat exhausted me before I reached the end of the block. Both feelings were real. That confused me. I had expected the move to be either a success or a failure. I hadn't prepared for it to be a good life that occasionally made me desperate for my old one. Near the end of my 5th month, my daughter called with news about the holidays. She and her husband had considered visiting Manila, but airfare for the entire family was more than they could justify. "We'll try next year," she said. I told her I understood. After we ended the call, I opened the airline website and checked the price of a flight to Colorado. Then I checked flights to Arizona. I had no house there and no car. Most of my close friends had downsized or moved away. Visiting would mean staying with someone or paying for a hotel and rental car. For the first time, I realized that returning to America, even temporarily, was no longer simple. I closed the airline website without booking anything. A few nights later, I woke shortly after 2 a.m. with pressure in my chest. I sat on the edge of the bed and waited for it to pass. It didn't. I tried to convince myself it was indigestion. I drank water, walked around the apartment, and sat down again. The pressure remained. Then I felt a dull ache move toward my shoulder. Paul had experienced heart problems during the final years of his life. I knew enough not to ignore what was happening. I called the front desk and told the guard I needed medical help. Within minutes, 2 members of the building staff were at my door. One remained with me, while the other arranged transportation to a nearby private hospital. I remember apologizing for my appearance as they helped me downstairs. It was an absurd thing to worry about, but fear doesn't always produce sensible thoughts. At the hospital, nurses attached wires to my chest, checked my blood pressure, and asked about my medical history. I answered as clearly as I could. Then someone asked for my emergency contact. I gave them my daughter's name and American phone number. The nurse looked at the number and asked whether I had anyone in the Philippines they could contact. I didn't. Until that moment, I had never thought of myself as having no one. I had children, grandchildren, friends, and people who cared about me, but none of them could reach that hospital quickly. No one nearby knew which medications I took, where my documents were stored, or what decisions I would want made if I couldn't speak for myself. I had prepared financially for an emergency. I had not prepared personally. The initial test did not show that I was having a heart attack, but the doctor wanted to monitor me and perform additional tests. I spent the rest of the night in a hospital bed, listening to footsteps in the hallway and watching the clock. Eventually, I called my daughter. It was afternoon in Colorado. I tried to sound calm, but she heard the fear in my voice. "What hospital are you in?" I told her. "Who's there with you?" "No one right now." That silence was different from the one after I first told her I wanted to move. This time I could hear her trying not to panic. She asked whether she should fly to Manila. I told her not to. The doctors hadn't found anything serious, and traveling that distance would take time. We stayed on the phone until a nurse returned. Before ending the call, my daughter said something that remained with me. "If this happened in Arizona, I could at least get to you." She lived several states away, so it wouldn't have been immediate. But America had felt reachable to her. Manila did not. The doctors eventually determined that my heart appeared stable. They believed the symptoms may have been caused by acid reflux combined with anxiety, but they advised me to follow up with a specialist. I was relieved. I was also shaken. The hospital was modern, and the medical staff treated me well. My international insurance covered eligible expenses after the deductible, although I had to complete paperwork and pay part of the bill before seeking reimbursement. The problem wasn't the quality of care. The problem was walking out of the hospital alone. It was early morning when I returned to the apartment. The guard who had helped me the night before asked whether I was feeling better. I thanked him and said I was fine. Upstairs, everything looked exactly as I had left it. A glass of water sat beside the bed. The the lights were on. One of my slippers was in the middle of the floor. I sat in the chair by the window and imagined what might have happened if the test had shown something serious. Would I remain in Manila for treatment? Would one of my children fly across the world? Would I return to America without a home, a car, or a doctor who still knew me? Until that night, I had measured the success of my move through monthly expenses. Rent was lower, transportation was cheaper. My savings were intact. But a spreadsheet couldn't tell me who would sit beside my hospital bed. It couldn't tell me where I belonged when I became frightened. For the next several days, I barely left the apartment. Every sensation in my chest made me stop what I was doing. I checked my blood pressure repeatedly and kept my phone beside me, even in the shower. My daughter called every day. She never asked me to come home. She didn't need to. The question had already taken hold. One night, unable to sleep, I opened my laptop and began searching for homes in Arizona. I told myself I was only curious. Then I typed in my old address. The original listing appeared with all the photographs still available. I stared at the kitchen first, then the bedroom, then the covered patio where Paul and I had spent so many mornings together. For nearly an hour, I moved through those pictures as though the house were still mine. Finally, I found the email address of the agent who had sold it. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then I began writing. I asked her whether the new owners might consider selling my house back to me. I rewrote the email 3 times. The first version sounded desperate. The second contained too many explanations. The final message was only a few sentences. I asked whether the buyers were happy and whether they might consider selling if I made a reasonable offer. The agent responded the following morning. She was kind, which somehow made the answer more difficult to accept. The new owners loved the house. They had already painted 2 rooms and enrolled their son in a nearby school. They had no reason to sell. She also warned me that even if they were interested, purchasing the house back would cost considerably more than I had received after closing expenses. I read the message several times. Of course the buyers didn't want to leave. To them, the house wasn't a mistake they could reverse for me. It was their new beginning. I opened a real estate website and searched the surrounding neighborhoods. Homes similar to mine were listed for more than I expected. Interest rates made borrowing expensive, and qualifying for another mortgage at 70 with retirement income would not be simple. I had money from the sale, but much of it was invested to produce income. Using a large portion to purchase another house would return me to the same situation I had tried to escape. I would own property again while worrying about maintenance, taxes, and how long the remaining money would last. Renting wasn't much more comforting. Apartments that appeared safe and comfortable cost far more than my Manila apartment. Some required deposits, application fees, and proof of income. Then there was everything else. I would need a car, furniture, kitchen supplies, insurance, a bed, even towels. I had spent months giving those things away because I believed possessions were holding me back. Now, every missing object represented something I would have to purchase again. That was when the panic became difficult to control. I started blaming Manila for everything. The noise, the traffic, the distance from my children, the night at the hospital. Problems I had previously considered manageable became evidence that I had ruined my life. I compared the worst moments in Manila with the best memories of Arizona. I remembered coffee on the patio, but not the roof estimate. I remembered Paul repairing things around the house, but not the years I spent there after his death. I remembered familiarity, but forgot the fear that had made me leave. My daughter listened while I explained how much it would cost to return. When I finished, she asked a simple question. Do you want to leave the Philippines, or do you want to stop feeling scared? I didn't know how to answer. At that moment, they felt like the same thing. She suggested that I come to America for a visit before making another permanent decision. Stay with us for a few weeks, she said. You don't have to solve the rest of your life today. Her advice was sensible. It was also exactly the kind of advice I had ignored before selling the house. I checked my original ticket. The return portion could still be used, although changing the date involved a fee. I booked a flight to Phoenix for 3 weeks later. My plan was to spend several days in Arizona, then stay with my daughter in Colorado. I told friends in Manila that I was taking a holiday. I told the building staff I would return the following month. I kept paying rent on the apartment and left most of my belongings inside. But privately, I believed I might never come back. As the departure date approached, my anxiety eased. Just knowing I had a flight made me feel less trapped. I began imagining familiar grocery stores, quiet streets, and dry desert air. I pictured myself renting a small apartment near my old neighborhood and rebuilding my life one item at a time. The cost frightened me, but I told myself peace of mind was worth paying for. On the morning of my flight, the guard placed my suitcase in the car. "See you next month, ma'am," he said. I smiled but didn't correct him. During the journey, I felt the same nervous excitement I had experienced when I first moved to Manila. Only this time, America was the foreign destination. After months away, I was going back to determine whether home was still waiting for me. I already knew my house wasn't. What I didn't know was how much of my old life had disappeared with it. The first thing I noticed in Phoenix was how quiet everything seemed. Even the airport felt orderly compared with the constant movement I had grown accustomed to in Manila. The second thing I noticed was the cost. I collected a small rental car I had reserved online. By the time insurance and additional fees were included, the total was much higher than the original price. Then I checked into a modest hotel near my former neighborhood. 1 week there cost almost as much as a month of rent in Manila. I had expected those expenses, but seeing them charged to my account made the idea of returning permanently feel different. The following morning, I drove through streets I had known for years. Everything appeared familiar from a distance. Up close, there were changes. A restaurant Paul and I used to visit had closed. The pharmacy had moved. Construction surrounded an intersection I had once driven through without thinking. I met my former neighbor, Susan, for lunch. She hugged me and asked dozens of questions about the Philippines. She wanted to hear about the food, the weather, and my apartment. For nearly an hour, I found myself defending the life I had been preparing to abandon. I told her about the cafe near my building and the guards who knew my name. I described the friends I had made and how easily I could get around without owning a car. When Susan asked whether I was happy in Manila, I hesitated. "Most of the time," I said. She nodded. "That sounds like anywhere." After lunch, she told me she planned to sell her house the following year and move closer to her sister. Another neighbor had already moved to assisted living. A couple from down the street had relocated after one of them became ill. I had imagined returning to the community I left, but that community was changing, with or without me. That afternoon, I drove past my old house. I told myself I would only pass it once. Instead, I circled the block and returned. The exterior looked mostly the same, although 2 large planters now stood beside the front door. A child's bicycle rested near the garage. I parked farther down the street. A woman stepped outside carrying a bag of trash. A little boy followed her, talking excitedly about something I couldn't hear. They belonged there. That realization hurt, but it also released something in me. For weeks, I had thought of the buyers as people occupying my house. Sitting in my car, I finally understood that it was their house. I wasn't looking at a life someone had taken from me. I was looking at a life I had completed. I drove away without stopping again. Several days later, I flew to Colorado to stay with my daughter. She had prepared the guest room and stocked the kitchen with foods she knew I liked. My grandchildren made a sign welcoming me home. Being with them felt wonderful. For the first few days, I wondered why I had ever chosen to live so far away. Then Monday arrived. My daughter and her husband went to work. The children left for school. The house became quiet. They had schedules that existed long before I arrived. There were practices, appointments, homework, and errands. I joined them whenever I could, but I was still a guest inside a busy family's life. I began searching for apartments nearby. The rent was even higher than in Arizona. Winter weather would make driving difficult, and living without a car was unrealistic in most of the neighborhoods I could afford. My daughter offered to make room for me permanently. She meant it, but I could see what that arrangement would require. Her home office would have to move. The children would share more space. Their routines would gradually bend around mine. I had left Arizona partly because I didn't want my retirement to become my children's responsibility. Moving into my daughter's house because I had panicked would create the exact future I feared. One evening, she and I sat at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed. She asked whether I had decided what to do. I thought coming back would make the answer obvious, I said. And did it? I looked around her kitchen. I loved being there. I loved knowing that if something happened, family was close. But I also missed my chair beside the window in Manila. I missed walking to the cafe in the morning. I even missed the noise I had complained about. No, I told her. It made everything more complicated. That wasn't entirely true. The visit had shown me one thing clearly. I hadn't been desperate to recover my old life. I had been desperate to know I still had a choice. I remained in Colorado for nearly a month. During that time, I stopped trying to make a permanent decision based on whichever place I happened to miss that day. Instead, I wrote down what had frightened me in Manila: the hospital, distance from family, not having a trusted emergency contact nearby, the cost and difficulty of rebuilding a life in America. None of those problems would disappear because I chose one country over another, but some could be managed if I stopped pretending that courage meant having no backup plan. I called my insurance provider and asked more detailed questions about emergency care, hospital admissions, and reimbursement. I contacted the private hospital in Manila and scheduled a follow-up appointment with a specialist for after my return. I also spoke with the American woman I had met during my first visit. She helped me find a local group where older foreign residents shared emergency contacts and practical information. My daughter and I created a folder containing copies of my passport, insurance policy, medications, and financial information. I gave her access to the details she would need if I became unable to manage things myself. Then I opened a separate savings account. That money would not be invested or used for ordinary expenses. It would remain available for an emergency flight, temporary accommodation, and the basic cost of returning to America if I ever truly decided to leave the Philippines. It wasn't enough to recreate the life I had sold. Nothing could do that. It was enough to give me choices. My daughter also helped me make a more realistic plan for visiting the United States. Instead of waiting until fear forced me onto an airplane, I would include one trip each year in my retirement budget. We chose tentative dates for my next visit before I left Colorado. Having a plan made the distance feel less permanent. The night before my flight, my daughter asked whether I was certain about returning to Manila. No, I said. She looked surprised. Months earlier, I would have tried to convince her, and myself, that I had no doubts. This time, I didn't need to. I'm not certain, I continued, but I want to go back. That was enough. At the airport, my grandchildren hugged me and asked when they would see me again. For once, I had an answer. I gave them the month of my planned return and made them repeat it so they would remember. My daughter held me longer than usual. "If you change your mind, you can come back," she said. I know. The difference was that I finally believed her. When I reached Manila, the familiar wall of heat met me outside the airport. Traffic moved slowly. Horns sounded from every direction, and my suitcase nearly tipped over as I struggled to load it into the car. None of it felt charming. But it didn't feel threatening either. It was simply part of the life I had chosen. When I entered my apartment building, the guard who had helped me during the medical scare stood from his chair. "You came back, ma'am," he said. I did. Upstairs, I unlocked the apartment and found everything where I had left it. My chair beside the window, the framed prints, a coffee cup drying beside the sink. The apartment was not the Arizona house, and it never would be. It contained no decades of memories. Paul had never repaired anything there. My children had never opened Christmas gifts in the living room. But it was no longer an anonymous rented room either. It was a place I had chosen to return to. Over the following weeks, I began building a life that was less dependent on optimism. I attended my medical appointments and kept copies of the results. I registered 2 local friends as emergency contacts and became one of theirs. We exchanged spare keys and agreed to check on one another if someone failed to answer a message. I joined a weekly walking group instead of relying only on occasional lunches. Seeing the same people regularly helped our friendships become more substantial. I also stopped measuring every decision by how little it cost. Moving to the Philippines had reduced many of my expenses, but affordability alone could not create a meaningful retirement. I needed relationships, routines, and a sense of control over what would happen if circumstances changed. Those things required effort. They also required money. For the first time, I allowed my retirement plan to include the possibility that I might not stay in Manila forever. That possibility no longer felt like failure. It felt responsible. I still thought about the house in Arizona, but I stopped checking its address online. What I wanted back had never truly been the furniture, the car, or even the house itself. I wanted the security I felt before I understood how quickly a life could change. Selling everything had taken away the illusion that I could always return to the past. Building a real backup plan gave me something more useful, a way to move forward without pretending I would never change my mind. It has now been more than a year since the night I searched for my old house. I still live in Manila. That statement may make it sound as though the story ended with a clear decision. It didn't. There are days when I'm grateful I moved, and days when I wonder how different life would be if I had stayed in Arizona. Both can be true. I enjoy waking up in a city where something is always happening. I like walking to the grocery store and not worrying about a car. My monthly expenses remain manageable, and the money from my house continues to provide security. I have also learned that living somewhere affordable doesn't protect you from loneliness, illness, or fear. Those problems follow you. They simply arrive in unfamiliar surroundings. My relationship with my children has improved since I began planning regular visits. We no longer treat every goodbye as an indefinite separation. My daughter knows when I expect to return. My grandchildren count the months. I remain connected to their lives even when I cannot be present for every moment. I have also become more honest with them. If I'm frightened, I say so. If I'm sick, I don't pretend I'm merely tired. Independence should not require the people who love you to guess when you need help. I don't regret moving to the Philippines. I regret believing I had to destroy every bridge behind me to prove I was committed. If I could begin again, I would still come to Manila, but I would arrive differently. I would spend several months here before selling the house, not 12 days in a hotel. Long enough to experience an ordinary routine, a difficult week, and a period when the excitement had disappeared. I would rent a regular apartment, shop on a fixed budget, arrange my own health care, and spend enough time alone to understand what that loneliness felt like. I would keep a small storage unit in America for at least 1 year. Not because furniture matters more than freedom, but because permanent decisions don't need to be made all at once. I would calculate the cost of returning before deciding I could afford to leave. That means more than purchasing an airline ticket. It means asking what housing, transportation, insurance, and rebuilding a household would cost if life abroad didn't work out. Most importantly, I would stop treating doubt as weakness. I moved quickly because I was afraid that hesitation would prevent me from leaving. Once I arrived, I hid my concerns because I didn't want my children to believe they had been right. Pride kept me committed long after I should have admitted I was struggling. The strange thing is that admitting those doubts didn't send me back to America. It helped me remain in Manila for the right reasons. I no longer stay because returning seems impossible. I stay because for now, this is where I want to live. That distinction matters. A few months ago, my real estate agent sent me a message. She wanted to let me know that the young family who purchased my house had completed several improvements. They replaced part of the roof, repainted the exterior, and planted a small tree near the patio. She included a photograph. For a moment, I felt the familiar ache. Then I noticed the little boy standing beside the tree with a watering can. Paul would have liked that. He believed houses should be cared for and filled with people. The house was doing exactly what it was meant to do. So was I. I had spent months believing that selling everything had left me with nothing to return to. But home was never going to be preserved exactly as I remembered it. Not in Arizona, not in Manila, not anywhere. Life continued while I was making plans, changing countries, and trying to decide where I belonged. At 70, I thought starting over meant creating one perfect new life and leaving the old one behind. Now I understand it differently. Starting over doesn't require you to erase everything that came before. And keeping a way back doesn't mean you expect to fail. Sometimes the bravest decision isn't selling everything and boarding a plane. Sometimes it's allowing yourself enough time, money, and flexibility to change your mind. I sold my house, my car, and almost everything I owned because I wanted freedom. 6 months later, I panicked because I believed freedom had taken away all my choices. What I eventually discovered was that freedom isn't having nothing left to lose. It's knowing that wherever you live, you still have the ability to choose what comes next. If you were approaching retirement, would you sell everything before moving abroad? Or would you keep a way back until you knew the new life was right for you? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy honest stories about retirement, second chances, and building another life abroad, subscribe for the next story.